Thank you, Merrill, and good evening, everyone. Good evening, honored guests and all of our attendees. On March 26th, the Los Angeles Times published an article titled "Greenhouse Gas Emissions May Be Worse Than We Thought, but Figuring Out the Right Way to Calculate Them is Complicated." That seems like a fair title. It goes on in the article and says that Los Angeles reports emissions that were only off by 50%. Cleveland, Ohio undercounted emissions by 90%. Torrance and Blacksburg, Virginia undercalculated by more than 100%. And the typical US city underreported emissions by nearly 20%. Well, we read that article and said, wait a minute, this can't be right. We need to understand much better, the state of this art, what we're doing, how we're progressing, and what we really should be doing. We reached out and we're blessed to get three wonderful speakers tonight. We're going to use the following format. Each presenter, I'll introduce each presenter in turn. They will do a brief presentation, and then we'll have a short Q&A. After the third presentation, we will then open to a longer Q&A, and all all questions are open and welcome. Please submit your questions in the Q&A portion of the session. We're going to begin with Dr. Keeling. Ralph's work centers on long-term measurements of the major constituents in air. He's been on the faculty at Scripps Institute of Oceanography, UC San Diego, since 1993. He was the first to demonstrate that O2 content of air is decreasing due to burning fossil fuels and has directed a program to track this decrease since 1989. Since 2005, he has also directed the Scripps CO2 program, which sustains the iconic record of carbon dioxide at Mauna Loa and other sites, begun by his father, Ralph Keeling, the famous Keeling curve, and where we are now somewhere around 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. He's engaged in ongoing research to refine estimates of sources and sinks of carbon dioxide using atmospheric measurements. Keeling has received the Rosenstiel Award in Marine and Atmospheric Chemistry, the Humboldt Research Award, and is a Union Fellow of the American Geophysical Union. Dr. Keeling, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joe, for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you. I don't intend to talk long. I think, as you will learn, our third speaker is the one who wrote that provocative article. So one role I have is to get out of the way so that he can present. I work mostly on the big picture stuff here on climate, and I'll say a little bit about that and a little bit about how that ties into the topics on today's agenda. So let me share my screen, which I think I know how to do. How does that look? Okay, so yeah, top down, bottom up. What are we talking about here? Okay, so let's back up and talk about the big picture. So this is the Keeling curve. I can't start without this. This is why we have a problem, or at least the measure, or an important measure of the extent of the problem. CO2 is just continuing to go up and up and up. We're bumping against 420 parts per million. When my father started in 1958, it was around 315, and it's increasing. It's higher than it's been in millions of years, and it's increasing faster than ever. COVID made a little blip in the emissions, but it varies enough year to year anyway because of changes in vegetation that we can hardly notice it. We really can't notice it clearly at the level of this. And of course, fossil fuel burning is rebounding. It's the main thing driving this record upwards. So we have a lot of work to do. Now, I'll start with a little insight. I hope this has got a nugget of wisdom that's useful. What's the relationship between CO2 and why are we talking about net zero? What's the relation between CO2 and climate, and why are we talking about net zero? Because that's in a sense what we want to get to. So it's useful to think about a simple world. This is not the real world, but it's a simple world. If you understand this, you understand it's a good starting point. In this world, all the CO2 we emit simply stays in the air. It's there. If you put it in the air, it stays there permanently. Okay. And second, the amount of warming relative to a natural world is just proportional to how much extra CO2 we put in the air. Okay, so in this world, the warming is simply proportional to cumulative emissions. In order to stop it from getting warmer, we just have to stop emitting. We just have to go to net zero. Okay, now this isn't our world. The real world has some complications. One of the complications is that not all the CO2 stays in the air. Some of it's absorbed by land plants and some of it's absorbed by the oceans. And so that sort of offsets some of the problem. Another issue is that the climate changes slowly, doesn't immediately respond to the extra CO2. There's a lag response to the climate system because of ocean's thermal inertial. A third complication is that the land and ocean absorption of CO2 actually in some measures, in important measures, gets less efficient as CO2 gets higher. So, and finally, CO2 itself becomes incrementally less potent as a greenhouse gas as you have more of it. This is due to something called band saturation. So how do you think about this complicated system? I'm recognizing that all these things are going on. The answer is these four complexities almost entirely cancel out. And so you end up, even in the real world, with the situation that the warming is essentially proportional to cumulative emissions. So even though this simple world is not our real world, complication 1 tends to cancel complication 2, and complication 3 tends to cancel complication 4. So we end up back with something that's like the simple world. So yes, we have to stop emitting to stop the climate from getting warmer. So we have to go to net zero. And this is an important point. Net zero is the point at which we stop making the problem worse. It's not returning to the past. It's just where we stop making it worse. Okay, so let's look at some trajectories of emissions that one might imagine. This was put together a few years ago, but the points are simple. We've been on a trajectory of burning more and more CO2 a year, and this is kind of a business as usual scenario extending through 2100. This puts us in a world that's much warmer. This really in almost, beyond catastrophe is how this has been characterized, beyond catastrophe. And the scenarios that get us to something that's more stabilized is like this one here. This involves some significant cuts in emission over the next few decades, eventually approaching a point where we're not emitting any more CO2 into the atmosphere the latter half of the century. This is where we get to net zero. In this scenario, we actually dip below to try to bring things down a bit. This allows a little overshoot. And the countries of the world have made pledges to try to reduce their emissions to get on a trajectory more like this lower one and less like this upper one. These are called the nationally declared contributions, and it reflects the general approach at the moment, which is really to have kind of volunteer efforts to do this. And then we look at each other and say, yeah, we can do more. Yeah, we can do more. So it's based on pledges. It's based to some extent on goodwill building. But a big question is, how do we know that people are doing what they pledge? I mean, a pledge isn't worth anything unless you can somehow test it and see that we're on the right trajectory. So how do we know how much we're actually emitting? And there's two general categories of approaches to verifying emissions. One is what I call bottom up. This is just using kind of straightforward accounting methods. And it's the approach that's been sanctioned by the IPCC for countries to report their emissions. You basically look at an activity, and you look at how much of that activity is going on, and that activity has an emission factor. You multiply those together, and that gives you the emissions. An example might be oil usage times the tons of CO2 emitted per barrel of oil. That gives you the amount of CO2 emitted as a function of the oil production or oil usage in some area. And then you basically sum over the various activities, and that leads to your emission inventory. This approach is important because it connects activities, which are the things we can change, to emissions. So we can't do without this approach, but it does have issues. Among them is that we might not really know these emission factors very well. How do we know we got them right? Another problem is that we might be missing something. We might not have a full tally of all the things going on. So there might be some process that we're not accounting for correctly. And so that you do need some reality check on this approach. And a really powerful reality check is just to look in the atmosphere, because after all, if we're emitting it, it's in the air, it should show up as some excess in the air. And I point out that the Mauna Loa record itself is kind of an ultimate verification point. If we can't bend this curve, we are not doing what we need to do to meet the terms of the Paris Agreement. So the atmosphere is telling us that some of all the emissions around the planet and the sinks. And so, but yes, this record itself is a kind of atmospheric verification of our efforts. But you don't just have to do it at the globe. You can do this at finer scales. And this is mainly what we're talking about here today, is the ability to look at emissions over domains smaller, like the domain of a city. So for example, there are measurements not just at Mauna Loa of CO2, but there are measurements all around the world with different countries and different programs. These are fixed ground stations where people are doing measurements. There's additional measurements from airplanes and ships and so forth. And you stitch together these measurements, and you can see if you're close to a region that has more CO2 being emitted, you'll see extra CO2 in the air, and you can make an inference about the emissions that are local or regional or the country scale from that. There's also satellites that have gone up to try to track CO2 and other species from air. And increasingly, this has become an important tool. It's still to some extent developmental, but it's got a lot of potential power going forward. And finally, one of the things I've worked on in addition to these background air measurements is looking at the scale of cities. I'm involved in a project called the Los Angeles Megacities Project, funded by the National Institute of Standard Technology, who, by the way, are also funding an effort in Indianapolis and in the Eastern Corridor. And what do we do here? We put analyzers for different greenhouse gases, in this case, mostly methane and CO2, at tower sites or building sites around Los Angeles. Each one of these is only measuring the amount of CO2 in the air at that spot. That doesn't tell us directly how much is emitted, but it tells us information that allows us to calculate how much is emitted if we know something about how the air is circulating. So you combine these point measurements with a model, a meteorological model of the winds and the circulation in the basin, and you can start to make inferences about the amounts of these gases that are coming out. And most of the effort to date has actually focused on methane. There's work ongoing on CO2. Methane is a little bit more tractable because it's only really being emitted. It's not also being taken up. CO2 is complicated because you have vegetation that makes it taken out during the day and emitted at night, and fossil fuel burning. And there's a need to unscramble the different components of CO2. Anyway, so methane, you can see the kind of things you can do here. This is the results of a paper by Vineet Yadav at the Jet Propulsion Lab, who's a collaborator on this work. And this is taking those point measurements that I said, combining with a meteorological model to get an estimate of where methane is actually being emitted into the air in Los Angeles. It's not magic. Even though we're not measuring in all these places, we can make inferences of other places because often we are downwind. So you can make an inference of where the methane is coming from based on times when you're actually downwind. You can see extra and say something about whether there's more methane coming from there. And what do you see? I mean, you see some granularity. The hot spots, some of these line up with known sources of methane, like the dairies in Riverside County really light up on this map. There's natural gas handling up in here, which evidently is a source chronically, although this is also where that large Aliso Canyon blowout was a few years ago. And these measurements, I'm not going to show that, also very easily detected that blowout from the atmospheric measurements and could help quantify it. Also notable is that they don't see a hot spot at a very large discontinued landfill called Puente Hills that was closed in 2013 and sealed up. And yes, indeed, you can see that it is not emitting much methane. That's important information too. Okay, so this is an example of the information that can be used to verify that inventories are either doing something that's more or less correct, or maybe failing us. Maybe they're missing something. So that's really all I have to say. I mean, there's a lot of work going on to refine these methods. Let me say a little more here. Most of these city scale projects are pilot projects, but they're already yielding important dividends. Maybe one other thing I want to say here is that how do we progress to getting carbon dioxide or fossil fuel emissions? One way to do that is with isotopes of CO2. In particular, there's an isotope of carbon, radiocarbon. It's radioactive. It's very low abundance. But because it's radioactive, it's completely absent in fossil fuels where it's all decayed away, whereas natural carbon in the atmosphere has a trace amount. And so you can actually pick up a signal of radiocarbon. And I think some of Kevin Gurney's works has benefited from that. So I would point out we have these two approaches. We have bottom up, we have top down. We need them both. It's not one is better than the other. The big limitation of top down, I should say, is that it also has significant uncertainties, but they're completely independent of the kind of accounting metrics that go into the bottom up. So they're very complementary, and in a way, it's a better audit because ultimately we care about what's in the air, and this is actually looking at what we care about. It's the relevant bottom line here, and the top down approaches, the bottom up approaches that depend on accounting. They're tied to activities. And I said, we need to know how the activities relate to emissions. And the top-down approaches can refine those emission factors so that we have better accounting. And I think some of Kevin Gurney's work shows we still have a ways to go in this stitching together of approaches. So that's all I'll say at this point. So thank you all.
Well, thank you, Dr. Keeling. We have, I'm sure we'll have some questions. I'd just like to start with one, the obvious one. In the LA Megacities project, is San Diego included? And if not, what do we need to do to get us included? And related to all of that, how do we know if we're measuring San Diego now that what we're measuring is from San Diego and using the top-down approach, not LA or Baja or atmospheric flows from the Pacific Ocean? Obviously the winds blow and the atmosphere mixes. So how do we have confidence that we're actually measuring what's happening here?
Okay, great. Yeah, so the first question is, no, San Diego's not in the LA megacities. I would rather it were the Southern California Air Basin project rather than LA megacities. But it's a pilot project, so it wasn't designed to do everything. It wasn't designed to be proof of concept. So it isn't really envisioning expanding to San Diego. On the other hand, I'm right here at Scripps, and we're measuring at the pier. So there is another station that's got all these things measured and more. But it's not enough to do all of San Diego. But a couple more stations in San Diego would fill in San Diego with the same density as LA. So we're not far from having something like that. And I would very much like to see that. For example, at Scripps, we can see, although we're miles west of the Miramar landfill, but we can see methane from the Miramar landfill showing up on certain nights. It shows up very clearly. So there's already information about San Diego emissions in our measurements that we haven't really tried to synthesize yet. So that's the first point. Then how would we know that the emissions are from San Diego? Well, it turns out that, not surprisingly, measurement in San Diego is more sensitive to emissions in San Diego than it is in LA. So actually, much of what you learn is fairly near field in these measurements, just by the way the atmosphere tends to mix things away after a while. So you have more information locally. So it's you do have potential influences from remote sources, and that requires that you have an understanding of what the air would be, what the air is coming in to San Diego before the emissions come into it. And the fact that we have such good quantification of Los Angeles from this project puts us in a beautiful position. It's a great example of how we might do a smaller city because we've already done the big city next to it. It's much easier to expand that way than it would have been to expand in the other direction. San Diego megacities would not have made sense by itself because of this problem. But adding San Diego to LA megacities is not a big step. It's not a big complicated step.
Well, let me just follow up then. What would it take to add San Diego? What do we have to do? Who has to do what?
Someone has to pay for it.
Okay. Any idea how much it costs? And I mean, is this something we should approach the San Diego City Council about, or?
I don't think it's the job of cities to do these proof of concepts because they have so many other things that they need to be doing. And this is funded at the federal level because it's of national interest to develop these capabilities. And I think that therein lies the problem because it's not really necessary or shouldn't be necessary for every city to do these methods. What you want is a refinement of the toolbox that can be applied to cities. And I think Kevin will really talk directly to that point, actually. So as much as we'd like to do San Diego as part of this, maybe Kevin has another answer for us.
Oh, okay.
We had a question from Robert, and he notes that the bottom-up approach is emission factor times activity factor. And his question is, isn't activity factor subject to the largest error? And how can we trust the reporting of that activity?
I'm not the best person to answer that. Actually, our second speaker, Nilmini,
I will.
is probably, let's just leave that question. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah, that's great. And Derek has asked the question, what is the upper limit parts per million of greenhouse gas saturation before humans can't breathe? Are we talking about greenhouse gases here and affecting people's breathing before it hits us in another way?
No. There's so many things that we should be worried about with climate change, but the composition of the air from the standpoint of sustaining life isn't one of them. So the CO2 buildup is small. It's certainly not threatening our ability to breathe. I study oxygen loss. I mean, this is the shocker. We're using up oxygen. And people are worried about that, but I just wrote a review article with some physiologists to make sure this wasn't wrong, but the oxygen changes are also too small. They're even incrementally much smaller. So there's very weak evidence for anything really significant here. I would point out there's one, I shouldn't even say this, but there's some literature out there that suggests that there may be some cognitive impairment at CO2 levels of the order of sort of 1,000 ppm or so. And as you raise outdoor levels, you also raise them indoor. So I'm intrigued by those papers, and it hasn't really made a lot of press, and maybe it's wrong, and maybe, but not every aspect of this physiology has been studied, but it's going to be something kind of subtle if it's anything at all. You know, it's intriguing that they have a signal at all.
Ralph, just to add to that though, in the OSHA, you know, this health and safety regulations, they do have some kind of limits for indoor CO2. You know, and you know, the CO2 is used to kill off insects in greenhouses. They just do bursts of like 10,000 parts per million. So those are things that come up in sort of my world. I see those every once in a while, those kind of numbers, like this 1,000 part per million. I forget what the UK has. The US also has some health and safety standard for CO2 indoors. So when you start approaching 1,000 or 2,000, then they say, okay, asthmatics might have some issue, things like that. So people who are sensitive. That's what I've seen.
One additional anecdote to that, just to add to this interesting sidebar conversation, is that CO2 is often used to kick off air exchangers inside a lot of public buildings. So there's CO2 monitors that look at the concentration inside the building, and at about 1,000 ppm, they kick off air exchangers, mainly just to keep oxygen from not dropping too low, which makes everybody sleepy. Libraries are notorious for this, right? It's a place that you want to take a nap, partly because everybody's in there breathing.
Yeah, I mean, just to get back to it, you can get to higher levels, but if you actually look at the numbers in the background atmosphere, I mean, the threat is the CO2 effect on climate and acidification and other things. It's not really at the physiological effects on animals that we're worried about here.
Right.
On a number of occasions, I've heard Dr. Ramanathan talk about short-lived climate pollutants, things like black carbon, HFCs, some pesticides, fire suppressants, and the like. And he made an intriguing statement one time recently. He said, this is suppressing the short-lived climate pollutants is the only silver bullet in the climate change world. That if we could suppress them, and they make up something like 45% of the pollutants in the atmosphere, the temperature would decrease by 0.3 degrees centigrade and give us time to work on the CO2. Are there any methods that you're involved in or know about to monitor SLCPs and that would contribute to reaching the silver bullet?
Well, I should say methane is one of those. It's maybe one of the prime ones. So, and Ramanathan is right. If you reduce you have potential to reduce them more rapidly than CO2. There's more infrastructure tied into CO2 emissions than there is to some of these short-lived pollutions. So there's potential to move faster on them. And this is in the spirit of trying to avoid moving into the worst territory as fast as we are.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't in any way. It's sort of to my mind, it's a kind of a nuance on this story about cumulative emissions being the problem and needing to get to net zero. It's not the big issue. I mean, so any solution that ignores fossil fuels and our need to cut emissions of fossil fuels down close to zero is not gonna solve this in the long run. We have to deal with that issue, and we should be dealing with the other ones as well, so that we can stay in some of these limits of damage.
Fantastic, thank you. Carl, do you have more? Should we move on?
Actually, I think time-wise, we need to move on to our next speaker.
Okay, thank you so much. Next, we have Dr. Nilmini Silva-Send. She's an associate director of the C. Hugh Friedman Fellow and Energy Law and Policy at EPIC, the Energy Policy Initiative Center. As a sidebar, EPIC does the greenhouse inventories for the City of San Diego Climate Action Plan and the county and Chula Vista and other places. So Dr. Silva-Send's work here is fundamental to what's happening in San Diego County and around the county. With over 20 years professional experience, she leads and manages the climate action and energy planning work at EPIC, including greenhouse gas emissions accounting, tracking trends, related regulatory issues relevant to cities and regions, development of greenhouse gas reduction policies, and monitoring metrics. Climate equity indicators and methods to achieve decarbonization and carbon neutrality. At the School of Law, she's developed and teaches an upper-level class in international energy law with a focus on international law, investment treaties, contracts, and dispute resolution, World Trade Organization law related to national energy policies, and linkages with climate change law. She also teaches law of the sea. Prior to joining EPIC, Dr. Silva-Send worked in environmental consulting in California, several European countries, and for the US Department of Defense facilities in Europe. She's developed and spoken at energy environmental policy capacity building workshops in Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and the Asian Development Bank, Manila, Philippines. She's taught upper-level courses in international law and international environmental law and European law at the University of Kiel in Germany. She has a BS in chemistry, an LLB from the University of London, and a PhD in international law with a focus on environment from the University of Kiel in Germany. And wow, what a background.
That was far too long. That was far too long, Joe, but thank you.
You're welcome. Please.
You picked it. I didn't give you that. Thank you, though, for the introduction. And yes, we've gone from California around the place and come back to California. So I've been working here for a while. Would you like me to share screen and get on with the presentation?
Yes, please.
Okay. So let me do what Ralph did here. Share the screen. Okay. All right, do you see that? Okay.
Yes, that's great.
Okay. So as Ralph mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about the greenhouse gas accounting that we do at the city and the regional level. So as he said, we need both, and I agree. Let me just get rid of all of you down there. Okay. And so what I want to talk about is I want to first put it into context as to why we're doing these emissions inventories, and then how they're done, and then what emissions they include and what emissions they do not include. So basically, okay, let's see. The inventories we do are really based on some kind of regulation, whether it's at the international level or if it's at the state level or regional or city climate action planning level. We, at the national level, when a country joins the UN climate change agreement or the Paris Agreement, they commit to providing these nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, and how they're going to actually reduce emissions compared with some start year. So the start year is called the baseline year of greenhouse gas emissions, is the inventory that underlies the targets that countries take upon themselves. And so these national inventories are really done using these IPCC methods. But in California, we have a mandate to reduce greenhouse gases under state regulation. And this regulation, you probably have heard, is called AB 32. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that, because that determines what we do at the regional and the city levels. And California also requires cities and plans to do greenhouse gas analysis under its Environmental Quality Act. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So how are these calculated? As Ralph mentioned, they are bottom up. They are by some kind of activity, or you can call it activity-based, or you can call it consumption-based. And then you can categorize those according to IPCC categories, by economic sector, or by AB 32 scoping plan categories. And so the question is, how does this look? And you've probably seen, I don't know if you've seen this one, but this is the California greenhouse gas inventory by IPCC category. And as you can see here, you know, if we've got inventories for every year, actually going back to 1990, but here this is only from 2000. And you can see here that they're separating the emissions that they're tracking into included emissions and then excluded emissions. So you can see here already that there are things that are excluded from a greenhouse gas inventory. Certain types of civil aviation, certain types of, you know, shipping emissions. And also there's another section called CO2 from biogenic materials that are tracked separately. So basically what happens is that's the state inventory by IPCC category. As I just mentioned to you, some things are included and some categories of emissions are excluded. Some of the short-lived pollutants that we were just talking about, like black carbon, are not included in this inventory. They are tracked separately. So what you might have seen are things like this, more like pie charts. If you take that IPCC inventory and you can categorize it into economic sector for the whole state, it looks something like this. And that doesn't look very different from what the scoping plan categorization looks like, where transportation, on-road transportation, is like the largest component of emissions in the state of California. It's not like that in every state. And so what I want to do in the next few slides is to take you through the policy and the regulatory highlights that lead us to understand why the cities and the regions are doing these inventories, and basically how they're supposed to be doing these. So we go back to 2005 to an executive order, which is EOS 305, that said that we should, as a state, achieve 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. And then there's another goal in there that says we should be about 80% less than 1990 by 2050. So if we look at this, if we put these on a timeline from 1990 to 2050, this is where we should go. And then the first goal of achieving 1990 levels by 2020 was made into law under AB 32 and basically set in stone the absolute amount of emissions that we should achieve by 2020. So it was about 430 million metric tons of CO2e, so carbon dioxide equivalent. What happens is, okay, so after this, the state also developed what's called a scoping plan, AB 32 scoping plan, which is basically a kind of an implementation or an action plan to show how the state would get there. And in that scoping plan, they suggested or they recommended that cities try to get about a 15% reduction below current levels, so that was around 2008, by 2020, okay? So cities were getting some heat as to that they should do something. And in addition, California said that now all plans and projects must also do greenhouse gas analysis and find ways to mitigate them. And a plan is also a project. So any plan, that means a plan that's developed by a regional transportation agency or a plan, general plan for the city whenever it's being updated. At that point, a city has got to do a greenhouse gas analysis and show how they're going to achieve these reductions. The question is, how much reduction should they achieve? Should they stick with this 15% or what should they do? And how should they do this analysis? Well, what happened is we had a lot of litigation following this requirement under the Environmental Quality Act. And basically what the litigation, it's continuing, but what it is showing us, or cities and regions, is that all projects and plans must show consistency with the goals of the state, which means that the cities and regions, when they do greenhouse gas analysis, they've got to show how they're going to mitigate in the same direction that the state is supposed to mitigate. Okay, so then in 2016, we've got an extension to AB 32. So we now have a new target for 2030 that is 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And so cities had to start looking at that target year as well. And then in 2018, we got this executive order which said that the state has to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. And so the cities are, going ballistic because they don't quite understand what this means. Basically, the cities are getting pressure from all around, but they've also, they know that they've got to do something. They've heard that local governments have an important role to play in reducing greenhouse gases. The UN has said that. You saw that in the Paris negotiations. The cities, though not a subject of international law as such, cannot take part, but they had lots of events going on. And GHG measurement in cities is now really a global trend. So how do we down here typically account for greenhouse gases in cities and in the region? So we basically, there are about 4 accepted framework methods that are used globally. The one that we used is called the Eakley Communities Protocol. And we use this because California had a say in developing some of these methodologies for cities, and the C40 cities use it, and the World Resources Institute kind of tends to use it. And it's based on scopes, direct emissions, indirect emissions, other indirect. But the main thing is it's activity-based, like Ralph was saying, it's bottom-up. Generally for cities, we're only looking at emissions from sort of 5 categories. So we're looking at electricity and natural gas end use or consumption. We're looking at on-road transportation. We're looking at water use and the emissions associated with that. And that is mainly because politically, there's a will to do something about that. There's wastewater treatment emissions, and then emissions from solid waste decomposition in landfills. But we're really only accounting for 3 types of greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide, methane, and N2O. And we call this carbon dioxide equivalent. For the region, we also do those inventories. We use this Eakley methodology, but we also have more activities. And so we have to end up downscaling the state inventory to the region using some kind of proportionality factor. So the regional inventory, say for San Diego County, has more categories of emissions. We have agriculture, we have some aviation, some marine vessels, And we also have more greenhouse gases like the HFCs. So as Ralph said, emissions is equal to the activity level multiplied by the emission factor. So let's take the example of electricity. This means the activity is the sales or the consumption, and we add to it down here the transmission and distribution losses, and we get kind of a load for generation. Now, if somebody had a question about is there a huge uncertainty in the activity data that we get? It depends on the category of emissions. I would say that electricity and natural gas are the best data, activity data we can get, because we've been working for years to try to get better and better data. We've isolated sources of uncertainty and errors in the way they categorize things by city. We've come up, we know what every facility uses for its generation. And so I would say that electricity and natural gas is the best as far as activity data goes. And then we have a emission factor. In this case, since we are doing city emissions inventories, we are using a citywide emission factor for electricity. And that is a weighted emission factor because it depends on the types of supply that the city gets. The reason we do this is because we've got to go back and separate out the local policies and allocate it to whether it comes from a local supply, whether it's grid, local utility, which is SDG&E, or whether it's some kind of direct access. They have different emission factors. And so we come up with a citywide emission factor. That's how we do the electricity emissions accounting. Natural gas is a bit easier. We get the activity data from the utilities, the same way as we get the electricity. And we can get all this data by consumer type, so residential, industrial, commercial. Sometimes we have privacy issues, got to deal with that. And for natural gas, of course, it's easier because there's only one standard kind of emission factor every year. For on-road transportation, things don't look quite as good for the activity data because by city, we just don't have fuel use by city, and it is practically impossible to get that. Even at the regional level, even though the California Energy Commission has done some surveys and does have some reporting for gas stations that sell for on-road transportation, they are unable to get very good activity data for the whole region. So for the cities and for the region, we end up using vehicle miles traveled. So that is the proxy we use instead of having fuel data. And the vehicle miles traveled data we get from our regional transportation planning agency, and it is modeled and calibrated only for some years. So that has sources of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And then we have an emission factor, which we get from the state emissions model, which is calibrated with DMV data and so on and so forth. So that is basically how we get emissions for each category in the greenhouse gas inventory. And then you end up, the cities take these and they put it in an appendix, and basically they have nice pictures. And the city of San Diego had a climate action plan like this. You can look at it like a pie chart, or you can look at, a bar graph, and you can look at how things change over time. The city of San Diego does it every year because they have the capacity to do it. Small cities cannot do that. And so the question becomes, are there gaps and uncertainties? And of course there are. Well, first thing is we're doing these based on some regulation, based on a certain methodology. We do the categories for cities based on what the cities think they have jurisdiction to do something about. And generally, we're just looking at 3 greenhouse gases. And as you saw, the activity data can be uncertain, and it also could be by proxy, could be model data. The only thing about this, doing this, and as Ralph said, we need to do this, is that it is consistent across geographies and time. So we've been doing this for the last, for cities since about 2015. For the region, we started in 2008. So we've identified lots of sources of error of the data. And so I think that we're pretty good at being able to identify when even the activity data is sort of incorrect. So we're able to track changes across geographies and time. And just to tell you how these inventories are used, basically two ways. One is to come up with the targets, because you need some baseline year of inventories. And then the second thing is to develop local policies to help meet these targets, right? So what you see is climate action plans. As you know from the litigation, as I said, all projects and plans are required to be consistent with state goals. Cities choose their targets based on an inventory year. So City of San Diego, for example, in the past chose 15% below 2010 in 2020 and 50% below 2010 in 2035. And you might see things like this where we have to calculate or estimate the kind of reductions we are expecting to get from the state big, large policies like the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which increases the renewables in the electricity grid, maybe some efficiency programs, and then the vehicle efficiency programs that we have. And then we put in the targets that are consistent with the state goals, and you see that there's a huge gap that, well, local governments are supposed to try to close this gap. Simpler version of this, this actually is from the City of San Diego. We've done these inventories for the past several years. You can see these are these black dots. And then if we put in the dots for the targets to be consistent with the state goals, we have this situation. This is our business as usual, what would happen with the current policies in place. Again, you see this big gap, right? All right, so for bottom-up accounting, the question is, are we making progress locally? So go back to our city's inventories of the last few years, and you can see, we've been going from a little bit above 10 to a little bit below 10. Whether this is within the uncertainty of all the methods is hard to tell, but according to the methods, we're using the same kind of methods, we are going down a little bit. But you can see that if we just draw a trend line here, or if we just follow this line, which is our business as usual, we're not going to make it at this rate of decrease. We need to get much greater reductions if we're going to get to our targets at the city level. And then the second question is, can actual measurements increase the confidence in city inventories? I think that there are some categories that we might be able to do this. I'm not sure we can do it with all. We're doing annual inventories. We're taking the emissions from a whole year's worth of consumption or end use. And then of course the question is, how much are we missing? But that's really not relevant to the inventories. I mean, at least we've got to try to make progress in the things that we are measuring, quote, or estimating from activity data. So I'm very curious about how much we're missing. I know Dr. Gurney's articles about we are missing a lot, and I'd like to hear more about San Diego. And so with that, I think I will stop and take questions or go on to Dr. Gurney, whatever you say.
Well, thank you so much. It was absolutely enlightening and very helpful. Are there, from what you said, if we're not on track, can I put you on the spot and ask, are there any policies that you would recommend that we urge the city and county to take on to close the gap, so to speak?
Yeah, that's very interesting. They're asking us that question too. What can we do? What can we do? And what we see are the difficulties that they face. First, financial. I mean, they hardly have time to digest any of this. Like I said, they're in a complete, I know their hair's standing on end when they are told that now you must see how you can reach carbon neutrality or zero emissions by 2045. They've just got their head wrapped around 2030 and just managing to crawl to getting some local measures to reach 2030. So they don't see how they can do it. And they're basically going to ask the state to do something. And another thing they're looking at is carbon offsets, which we are not encouraging them to do. So, but it's coming up. I mean, we're not telling them, we're trying to just stay factual. So I'm afraid I can't answer that question.
Fair enough. Carl?
Well, actually, we're a little bit behind, and I appreciate that what you just spoke about did generate some good questions. But I'm thinking, in the interest of making sure that we get our third speaker in, and then I think you guys might be really adept at choosing the right person to answer the question. So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves by asking these questions maybe until we hear from our last speaker. But I definitely appreciate what you just said, and you have inspired some questions. So we will be firing them to you a little bit later.
All right,
Okay.
thank you. Mhm.
Thanks, Carl. Well, our third speaker this evening is Dr. Kevin Gurney. He's an atmospheric scientist, ecologist, and policy expert currently working in the areas of carbon cycle science, climate science policy at Northern Arizona University, where he's professor of informatics and computing and cyber systems. He has degrees from Berkeley, MIT, and Colorado State. Dr. Gurney's current research involves simulation of global carbon cycle using inverse approach, linkages between terrestrial carbon exchange and climate variability, and deforestation and carbon climate feedbacks. Most recently, he's worked on research characterizing fossil fuel CO2 emissions at the global, national, that's Project Vulcan, that I'm sure he's going to talk about, and urban, Project Hestia, that I hope he'll also talk about, scales. Using data mining and innovative algorithms, these greenhouse gas quantification efforts are being used by analysts, scientists, and governments, and are a core component of the NASA-led carbon monitoring system. The urban work in particular is anchoring new efforts at NASA and the National Institute for Standards and Technology to develop urban-focused carbon monitoring and modeling. Dr. Gurney is an IPCC lead author, an NSF Career Award recipient, Sigma Chi Young Scientist recipient, Fulbright Scholar, and has published over 140 peer-reviewed scientific articles and multiple papers in Nature and Science, and a book from MIT Press titled Mending the Ozone Hole. Dr. Gurney.
There we go. Okay. Let me know that this shows. You should be seeing my slide. I'll go into presentation mode.
It does. You're great.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Joe and Meryl, and thank everybody for coming. I'm amazed there's over 70 people, I think, participating on this call, which is impressive in itself. And I'm always reminded, you know, as depressed as this subject can become, I'm always heartened when I see so many people interested and volunteering their time to be involved in the solution of this problem. So I commend all of you for being involved. I get paid to do it, so that's not so hard, right? So I'm going to talk about this new approach to quantification. It's not that new. We've been doing it for quite a few years now, that tries to quantify greenhouse gas emissions all the way from an individual building all the way up to the planet and maintain consistency between the two. First, as Joe mentioned, is a project that I began in my group in about the mid-2000s, early mid-2000s, called Vulcan. And really at the time, it was an attempt to solve a problem really within carbon cycle science. It wasn't necessarily aimed at stakeholders or policymakers at the time, but it was an attempt to just do a better job at this piece of the carbon cycle, the fossil fuel combustion piece. And as Ralph mentioned, there's other parts of the carbon cycle, oceans, plants, so on and so forth. But the fossil fuel piece had been quantified in relatively crude ways. They were adequate for the time. But as we began to get more and more interested in finer and finer spatial scales and temporal scales around the planet, it was clear that we needed to do a better job of this piece of the carbon cycle. So we set our mind to improving that. This was our first release. It was back in the late 2000s. It was for the year 2002, and we quantified all the fossil fuel CO2 emissions across the United States at about 10 kilometers on a side. We did that for every hour in the year 2002. In a minute, I'll explain some of the methods. We've continued that work since that time and have added and embellished and improved it. Now we're producing the same data product at about a half a kilometer every hour for multiple years. We now span about 2002 up to 2015. And in fact, right now we're working on an update to that will reach us up to 2019. And we're even working on a product that will hopefully get us into real time. And I'll mention that a little bit later on. One thing to note about Vulcan, first of all, it's made for the whole United States. It is a scope 1 data product, which means that the emissions in Vulcan are the emissions that are physically emanating from a piece of landscape. That's in contrast to, for example, people in a piece of landscape may be consuming goods and services that are giving rise to emissions all the way around the planet. We account for emissions only that physically occur from a piece of geography. That's typically referred to as scope 1. That goods and services, as they occur elsewhere, is referred to as scope 3. And scope 2 is really electricity emissions allocated to the point at which electricity is consumed. Vulcan puts the emissions at the power plant, although we now have a scope 2 data product where we do allocate it to the consumption point. And I'll mention that a little bit more in a minute. So that was Vulcan. That took a lot of time to get that done. We've since moved on. We're now able to carve out from that landscape individual cities. At half a kilometer, it's a viable thing to do. These are just some examples. This is Chicago, Milwaukee, San Francisco, Sacramento, Stockton. This is the Houston area, Beaumont, Texas, Boston, Providence area, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. Now it's still kind of clunky looking. It's in squares that are about half a kilometer. I think this is a 1 kilometer data product of our Vulcan emissions. But after the first Vulcan release, there was a lot of interest in diving down deeper into individual cities. And so we set about trying to do that. The first city that we did was the city of Indianapolis. I was at the time a professor at Purdue University, and Indianapolis was really the closest big city. And we attempted to dive down into Indianapolis and quantify emissions right down to the individual building scale and road segment level. And these three, I'll run it again, the three sort of colors you were seeing is the red is sort of commercial buildings, green is the residential sector, and those kind of aprons are the roads. And in this case, it's just the major arterials in the city. Now to do this type of thing, and this, by the way, is completely nested within Vulcan. The two are completely internally consistent and conserve mass. So if you add up Hestia, it fits perfectly inside a box inside Vulcan. Now, the methods that we use for this are admittedly extensive. Vulcan mines about 25 to 30 different federal data sets. When we do Hestia, this individual city estimate, we dive down and mine data from the local city. Now, in general, it follows the same type of bottom-up techniques that the previous speaker mentioned, that we're using roughly activity times emission factor. But in this case, I would say we go a bit further than that. So for example, 38% of the fossil fuel CO2 signal in the United States is directly monitored at the stack level. The pollutant effluent is measured in the stacks. So we have a direct flux monitoring measurement that we use in this system. We use a lot of carbon monoxide emissions reporting, which is an air quality species that's been monitored and reported for now almost 50 years. And because a lot of the sources are the same between CO and CO2, we'll often leverage a lot of this information off of CO, which allows us to get, by the way, a lot of this detail, which is difficult to get when you're using fuel statistics purely. But we also use activity methods. In fact, we probably use about a dozen different methodologies and overlap them where we can, which I think is one of the reasons why the data product performs reasonably well. So keep that in mind. There's sort of two different worlds here. There's the Vulcan world that does the whole US down to about a half a kilometer. And then there's Hestia, in which we dive very deep into an individual city and generate an awful lot of detail right down to the infrastructure level. So the Hestia treatment, we haven't done in every city in the United States. It's rather time consuming. We've done it in the original city we started out in, that's Indianapolis, and here in the upper left. We've done this for Salt Lake City. We've done this down here for Baltimore. We've done, the most recent big city we've done is the entire LA megacity, all 5 counties, every single building, every single road segment across the entire urban landscape. We're doing work in the Washington, D.C. to Baltimore corridor. We're going to do the entire corridor. And then I have lots of colleagues that are using similar methods in a variety of cities around the planet. There's excellent work going on in Boston, going on in Toronto, Paris, Sao Paulo, and then we've been involved in projects in both Melbourne and Auckland, New Zealand. So this very detailed way of trying to characterize emissions in cities is starting to propagate, but again, because it's intensive, it takes a lot of work, it's not easy to propagate it quickly. Now, the study that I think Joe and Meryl noticed that got them in touch with me is this recent paper that we published in Nature Communications, where we took our system, in this case it was Vulcan, in which we carved out all the cities. And by the way, we have carved out every single city in the United States out of Vulcan. And we've actually done it by 6 different, sorry, this thing is moving by itself, 6 different urban boundary types, because different disciplines consider a city differently. There's governance boundaries, of course, but economists think of them as economically integrated areas. There's, of course, metropolitan regions. Satellites now have been used to define what the edge of a city is. We've used all those different definitions and carved out all the cities in the United States down to the smallest township. And we found about 48 cities that had built self-reported inventories, that we had enough information such that we could break them apart and do a fair comparison between what Vulcan produces, Scope 1 emissions, and Scope 1 emissions in these various cities. Because many cities quantify other aspects of emissions, the Scope 3, for example, that I mentioned, which is not comparable to Vulcan. So we tried to pare those cities down and only compare the portions that really were fairly compared. And as Joe mentioned, we found a lot of sort of random variation in comparing to cities, but on average, about a 20% emissions were lower than what we would estimate in Vulcan, with a lot of scatter. Sorry, this is advancing on its own. And a lot of scatter around the Vulcan estimate. Now, Vulcan has uncertainty, which is the blue bars in this graph. It's not small, it's considerable, but we carefully quantify it in each one of the sectors that we tackle. There's lots of reasons for these differences. Some of these are potentially methodological, some of them are categorical, and some of them are just omissions of actual data within the systems. Some of the data is very, very difficult to get. And I'm the first person to admit that the protocols that are out there that cities use, I think, are actually very good. They're very well thought out. I actually personally spent a lot of time with the people that produced a lot of those protocols, and I think they're good. I think the toughest part of this problem is the data. Getting data is tough, it's difficult, it's tedious, it's hard to get it comprehensively for a city. Lots of things are often left out. And I think one of the virtues of Vulcan is that it is very thorough. It's very comprehensive. It adds up to the exact amount of fuel consumed, sold, and bought in the United States. And so it maintains consistency through scale, which is one of its virtues. But it definitely has uncertainty still at the urban scale. Now, I want to go back to something that Ralph mentioned. Now, the bottom up, which I'm showing here in the upper left in this sort of Hestia example, you could think of that as then, of course, being transported through the atmosphere as a city. And this is a simulation of CO2 as it blows off the top of power plants and cars and so forth. And then, of course, we can measure that in the atmosphere, the important work that Ralph does. And the atmosphere is critically important because, as he mentioned, it unambiguously really tells you what's going on at the surface. Now, tying a measurement in the atmosphere to emissions at the surface is a tough thing to do. We effectively have to run an atmospheric transport model backwards. And in reality, what we do is we iterate between what we see in the atmosphere and what we estimate at the surface. And the goal really is to make these things totally internally consistent so that what we estimate with all our detail in our bottom-up emissions inventories are consistent with what the atmosphere sees. And that really gives us the best of both worlds. We have a lot of the detail that we get from those inventories. We have all the buildings, we know which buildings, we have all the vehicles on the roads, we divide that up into 28 vehicle classes, so on and so forth. Very helpful detail. that is consistent with the accuracy that the atmosphere can bring us, the way we can carefully measure the atmosphere at different locations. Now, so we've done a bit of this convergence between the atmospheric monitoring and these bottom-up inventories. And again, we often talk about them as bottom-up versus top-down, but I want to propose that actually going for ultimately is pure consistency between the bottom-up and the top-down. And this is a study that was done recently by colleagues in which they used atmospheric carbon-14 CO2. Ralph mentioned this, a radioactive isotope of carbon that is a perfect tracer for fossil fuel CO2. And they used that measurement in the atmosphere inverted to get the fluxes through that reversal of atmospheric motions, and compared that independently to what Vulcan estimated. The two were within about 1.5%. That was heartening for Vulcan's accuracy, at least at the aggregate scale. And then we did the same thing in the city of Indianapolis, the other place where we have a very detailed, both bottom-up inventory and a very detailed set of atmospheric monitoring. Work is ongoing in LA, as Ralph presented, but we haven't gotten to CO2 there yet. But in Indianapolis, we've done the CO2 problem. And in that case, the atmosphere and Hestia agree to within about 3%. Now that's only two places where we've been able to do intercomparison. That does not necessarily mean that Vulcan or Hestia are correct everywhere, but it certainly gives us some confidence that these systems that we've built with all these data mining techniques and so on and so forth are at least performing for these first two examples reasonably well. In fact, better than we probably thought initially. Now, as I said, ultimately, what I think we want is really, we've been talking about, I think, the emissions as if there sort of are two ways of doing it. And there are two ways of doing it, but in some ways, we tend to talk about them as if they're competing with one another, or one is used to check another. And that's certainly a useful thing to do initially. But I would argue that ultimately what we want, there is only one atmosphere. There's only one physical emission coming from the surface. And so what we want is the best estimate of fluxes that complies with all of the information we can bring to estimate those same fluxes. And of course, on the right-hand side, we have lots of atmosphere both at the ground, aircraft. We now have spaceborne instruments. Ralph showed a few of those, doing a variety of different measurements of CO2 and other species that relate to CO2. On the left-hand side, we have things like Vulcan and Hestia doing all this data mining. Indeed, this includes city inventories, all the inventory work that's being done. Those really should be thought of as two constraints on estimating fluxes as best as we can. And so I think the idea is we want to bring those into some form of an optimization system where we're leveraging all of that information, because it's all data to a certain extent, and then coming up with the best estimate of a flux. And that single flux should be the one that we use. I don't think actually that cities should be burdened with having to do this. It's actually quite a difficult and tedious thing to do. And I think that really we should have a single system that does this across an entire national landscape, all the way down to buildings, all the way up to the nation, that leverages all of this information to produce the best estimates that are possible. And indeed, I think you can draw an analogy to something like weather forecasting. 50, 60, well, more like 70 years ago, around the time of the Second World War, there really was not an integrated weather forecasting system on the planet. And it was through the Second World War that it was clear that there was a great need to have better weather forecasting. At the time, it would not have been sensible to expect every city or locality to collect weather data, run a weather model, analyze the results, and come up with a forecast. That would not be a sensible way to treat a problem of the collective global atmosphere. And in the same way, I don't think we should be doing greenhouse gases this way either. It's redundant, it's expensive to do it in these one-off city after another approaches. We should be building something that's much more akin to a national weather forecasting system that leverages all of the data everywhere, leverages the knowledge that cities have generated in coming up with their estimates, leverages the type of information that Ralph and colleagues are collecting in the atmosphere, and brings it together in a singular system, and then provides it to every locality, just like weather data is provided publicly to everyone through a collective sort of system. And so we're beginning to think about this. We're talking to the administration, the Biden administration, about a system like this. It's been on the minds of a lot of people, not just me. And we think it really may be a much more sensible way to approach this problem, because we would maintain consistency, we'd avoid redundancy, it's a lot more cost effective, so on and so forth. So let me turn to some of the questions that Joe and Meryl sent. I'm not going to answer every single one of them, because some of them were better answered by other speakers, but I'll try to tackle the ones that I think I can bring some insight to. The first, can we identify precisely where emissions are coming from? And I think we can, with these sort of detailed approaches, calibrated atmospheric measurements, a very important piece of the puzzle in my opinion. We can go from these kind of bulk inventories that provide sort of a sector total down to something that you see on the right. This is actually just an image from our Indianapolis Hestia system, showing all of that detail. And the detail is pretty important, because as we think about different policy instruments, we may want to separate large from small, even within a given sector. And I'll give some examples of that in a minute. How are measurements done, and what are the relative strengths? And I think that I'll answer sort of the second part, what are the relative strengths, since I think you've seen how these measurements are done. And I think the bottom-up approach is great because it's got lots of resolution. It has lots of information about function. What is giving rise to an emissions? Who is doing it? At what time during the day? It's great at space and time detail. Atmospheric measurements, the other way of approaching the problem, are excellent at maintaining mass conservation. They're very accurate. But really, ultimately, the combination of the two provides, I think, the best solution to this problem. You get accuracy and detail at the same time. And indeed, they're rather complementary in that their weaknesses and strengths are almost inverse of one another. And so they're very complementary. How do we know if we're on course? Here is where I think something that is produced closer to real time might be really important. One of the difficulties we've had in doing the bottom-up work is the latency of the data. Often we're 2 or 3 years behind real time. I think as we move forward, as we engage in tougher and tougher policy and get more and more serious about mitigation, we're going to need to be able to course correct. We're going to need to be able to see how well are we doing? Are we seeing what we thought we were doing to the atmosphere? And if we're not, how can we course correct? That's where I think real-time feedback becomes crucial. I also think this is where the atmosphere is really particularly applicable, because the measurements taken in the atmosphere are almost by virtue continuous and in real time, at least typically. However, I will say that our bottom-up techniques were working hard on bringing into real time. This is an example of something that we've just produced. It's in review right now. This is not granular. This is the whole United States, but we're now producing a whole US fossil fuel CO2 data product that's in real time. It's up to last week. We update it weekly. In fact, we've even been doing a 2 to 3 month forecast based on this system. This plot right here just shows, because what stimulated this work was the COVID and what was happening to activity during the lockdown period. And what you see in that curve with the little colored dots is all the lockdown activity. It's the percent of the population that was under lockdown over that period of time during early 2020 through March and April and May. And then what you see in the other curve is fossil fuel CO2. And of course, they're inversely related during the lockdown, whereas as activity went down, as activity was locked down, emissions declined. And as we came out of lockdown, emissions went back up. And it really has only been in the last 2 to 3 months that emissions are returning to pre-COVID levels. And in fact, they are almost completely back to pre-COVID levels, with the exception of the aviation sector, where jet fuel remains a little bit low. But I suspect this summer it'll be back to normal like everything else. So would knowing all this stuff help us prioritize emissions? And this I would give an emphatic yes. I think this is both in terms of planning efficient targeted mitigation and keeping track of policies individually. And let me give you a couple of examples. This is an example out of our LA work. This is just the on-road sector. Actually, the top picture on the right is residential and the top picture on the bottom is commercial. But the plot on the left is the on-road emissions on a cumulative plot. And really what this says in simple terms is that 10% of the road surface in Los Angeles accounted for 60% of the emissions. Now that's important because if you're interested in policy and instruments at the sub-city scale, knowing where the emissions are large might be the place where you go first to mitigate, because that'll be the most efficient place to do it. You'll get the biggest return on mitigation investment by going after the big stuff first. And almost every sector in cities, when you look at the emissions, they're almost all like this. They are what we call log normal. That means that a few large things account for the majority of the emissions. And that means it may not be fruitful to waste a lot of time on small stuff. It may be important to target the big things, but of course, to target them, you have to know where they are, what they are, and who to talk to about reducing them. Here's another example from Salt Lake City. This is the building sector, and this just shows in Salt Lake City these different patterns. When you look at building emissions in absolute terms, which is what this map shows, this is emissions per person. You see the patterns dramatically change. And this is emissions per unit area. And in fact, the pattern goes from a east-west pattern now to a north-south pattern. Now, these were all dictated, it turns out, by, not surprisingly, housing size, income. A lot of basic socioeconomic variables dictated some of these patterns. And our argument is that knowing the details of these patterns might allow you to fashion policies that are much more targeted and hence more efficient. So the final question that I can answer, at least provide some insight into, is how can the improved tools be applied to San Diego County? And as I mentioned before, we have carved out every city. I'm just showing an example of the county in that upper right, with some of the kind of quick detail in bulk on the lower right. But to answer this in terms of Hestia, that sort of greater level of effort, we have Vulcan 3 results for the county now. Right now, it only goes up to 2015. We're working on updating the entire system to 2019, which will be ready in about a year. And then ultimately, of course, we want to bring that real-time data product all the way down to the same granularity that we do in Vulcan. That's going to be hard, and it will take some time, but that certainly is our goal. Now, in the near term, we can do Hestia cities. We've been adding them as we go. That's been really dictated by scientific research funding, since that's really the domain that we're working in. We don't have a business, we don't sell this to cities or anything like that. It's really done through research and through work with people like Ralph and others that we've been doing various cities. But we certainly can make a case to our funders that there are important reasons to add cities to the list that we're doing. And one of the really important reasons is, I'll give you a couple. One is that with people like Ralph measuring the atmosphere, that's absolutely crucial. That's not occurring in many cities around the United States. And where we have the type of assets that we have, like the work being done at Scripps, this is crucially important. The other thing is a motivated stakeholder policymaker community, because I think we're at the point now where we've done a lot of research and there's a lot more to learn as we do this scientifically, but there's clearly an interest both from our funders and from us individually that we want to link with stakeholders and provide them with information that's useful and that will be operationalized into mitigation. So having a motivated stakeholder community, I think, is also an important selling point to add cities to the sort of collection that we're trying to grow from the sort of 6 or 7 that we have right now to a larger list. And then finally, I'd say cities that represent additional diversity to the list we've had. You know, we want to be in warm, dry cities and moist, wet cities and industrial cities and suburban cities. You know, that sort of diversity exercises some of our techniques, both to see where we're not doing well, and there are plenty of places where we still don't do a good enough job, to those things where we're doing well and knowing the difference. So I'll end with that, I think, and just note that there's a lot of people that helped me do all this. I'm putting some of their happy faces here, and some of the folks that have funded this research over the last 15 years. Thanks.
Joe, you're on mute.
Okay, am I back?
No, you're fine. I want to say thank you so much to all 3 presenters. This was just so enlightening and so wonderful. Most appreciated. And in San Diego, I know would love to get on the list of cities to be Hestiaized, if that's a new verb.
Joe, I want to take a
Carl, go ahead.
to go back and ask some questions that were asked during Dr. Silva-Send's.
Yes, please.
Because I think we need to hit some of those. So Robert asked, is the IPCC greenhouse gas inventory by category estimated or measured? I hope that's a clear question.
Yeah, it's not measured in the way that Ralph is doing, or in the way that Kevin, well, Kevin is combining lots of sources of information. It is not measured. It is estimated from activity. Okay,
great. Thank you. I'm hoping some of these are succinct, because these are good questions that have answered. JW asked, does natural gas activity data accurately reflect leakage during production, storage, and delivery? And do IOUs report leakage in addition to usage?
No. Well,
that is
let's put it this way.
Okay,
let's put it this way. I think it should be, I don't understand why IOUs do not stop leaks. I was out walking the other day and there was an SDG&E truck and they were doing some work, and I said, what are you doing? He said, fixing leaks. I said, wow, okay. And then I saw them all around Del Mar fixing leaks. So obviously they'd found some various sources of leaks, and you think that economically they would do it. Now we capture the emissions from what they sell, so what we consume at the end. So we're missing the leaks of methane in the system. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. That's very important, and I appreciate that. Ruth asked, why isn't agricultural use factored into GHG emissions? Is this because it's primarily oriented towards cities? Is agriculture use factored in other regions?
Yeah, agriculture is factored in where it is important, where it is a sector. So the region, the county of San Diego definitely has a big agriculture component. Another city that has some is Oceanside in our area, but the city of San Diego does not have any agriculture in their inventory. It's just a matter of whether it is economically important to this city or not.
Could I just add, there's 2 sort of components to agriculture and how we think about it. In Vulcan, machinery that's used, so a combine or a tractor that's burning diesel, are captured in the fossil fuel inventory as part of the agricultural sector. And then there's, of course, CO2 that's released and taken up by plants and soils that isn't in Vulcan, but is in other inventory work done by colleagues that do, you know, land-based and ecological-based inventories.
Yeah, we do have it for the region of San Diego, for the whole county. We also look at wildfire emissions, but they're not really part of the inventory itself, just like California's inventories tracks those things separately.
Excellent, thank you. Marie asked, the Trump administration reduced monitoring requirements for leakage of natural gas. Does California have their own requirements to?
Not yet. But the Biden administration, I think, has put it back on. So I think that has been reversed, which would mean that more tracking of leaks from production.
Okay, this question is from me. I do a lot of work trying to reduce VMT, and it's always irked me that we have to do really gross estimation with VMT. Do you see anybody suggesting that we dial it in a little bit further and try to find what types of vehicles people are using so that we have a better understanding rather than really gross estimates of
No, we do know VMT by vehicle type. We know that most of these miles are actually passenger vehicles. That means SUVs as well. We do have fuel economy data as well. We know it by speed as well. So we do have more granular data, but to get the on-road transportation component, we rely on VMT. And some of the VMT data might be okay in the year that the transportation agency calibrates it. So they do this every 4 years. They do a base year, and then they calibrate it with DMV data. They calibrate it with what's called the Highway Performance Monitoring System data. And so it's the years in between that get problematic. The further you get from that base year, which is more or less calibrated with something, the worse they get. And it's a projection based on socioeconomic data, based on population, demographics, everything. So I would say that for a base year, when they start doing their VMT analysis, that base year is the best VMT data you have. So that's what we try to tell, we try to focus on those years. Like for San Diego County, 2012 is a base year for that agency. 2016 is a base year. And they're going to have huge problems because they won't be able to do 2020 because of COVID, right? So they're going to have to choose a different base year. Yeah, but I would say that the base year is not too bad. And if you want more detail on VMT by vehicle type, we have it, they have it.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, those were, I think, the crux of the questions that I skipped over. So these are questions that came up during Dr. Gurney's discussion, but obviously anyone that has a good answer for these, please feel free to jump in. Robert asked, how does Vulcan capture airplane emissions?
It captures it through the CO reporting from that sector. It's done at the county level. It takes into account really the taxi, takeoff, and landing cycle of airplanes. So once they go above 3,000 feet, it's out of our system. We do quantify emissions aloft, but we do it in a different data product. And that we have to just use flight trajectories and the amount of fuel. But for below 3,000 feet, it's capturing the landing, takeoff, and taxiing component. Then all the other emissions at the airport, and that includes baggage carts, the buildings, so on and so forth, they're either allocated to the commercial sector if it belongs to the buildings, or the non-road sector if it belongs to things like baggage carts and other mobile devices that are at an airport.
And we do that too. We basically the San Diego airport, for example, does a greenhouse gas inventory and does look at airplane emissions up to 3,000 feet. And so we use that in the regional inventory as well as these other components that you were mentioning.
Okay, thank you. It sounds like it's a little bit like international shipping. Once something gets outside of the boundaries of the city, it's a lot harder to put your finger on who owns those emissions.
Right. But, the national inventory, they must have a way of allocating those among countries.
Yeah, it's a category that's referred to as bunker fuels. All the countries in the world essentially put international, both aircraft and commercial marine vessels, into this kind of category called bunker fuels that nobody really has to take ownership over. It's fortunately not a huge piece of the global fossil fuel emissions, but it's a piece that matters. This is also, by the way, one of the differences that often when we're looking at the EPA inventory that's done for the US and submitted to the United Nations, some of the differences are due to these categorical distinctions between what belongs to the sort of international non-country category and what is the provenance of a given nation.
Mm-hmm. Just to add to that, California in its inventory includes for aviation only the interstate aviation. It does not include the intra-state. So out of California within the US is not included in the inventory. So it's similar to the, I don't know who takes care of that, but I guess it's the US government.
Right. Joe Biden does it. Okay, this is a question that I had regarding Vulcan, and I think you kind of covered this, but maybe there's other things you could say about it. I was wondering, since it's combining kind of bottom up and top down, and I'm sure you've had to bench test it, and it sounds like that's part of how you keep refining the model. Are you able to crowdsource and work with other teams to kind of show them how your model works and see if they can put it to use too, to try to help refine it?
So we haven't done crowdsourcing yet. This is something we've talked about a lot. We certainly do intercomparisons with lots of other inventories, both, I mean, we intercompare it obviously to EPA and the Department of Energy, fuel statistics. We do comparisons to other data products that researchers make. There's a few in circulation, things that aren't necessarily as detailed as Vulcan, but there's global data products that we compare to. And then again, we've done sort of 2 initial comparisons to atmospheric monitoring. Now, right now, I want to be clear, Vulcan does not include atmospheric monitoring as part of its optimization. We just luckily matched the atmosphere well, so we haven't done any optimization yet. I'm arguing that as we move forward, we want a system that automatically integrates the 2 instead of the sort of slow and clunky version that we're doing now, which is that we take the results from Vulcan, we compare it to the atmosphere and see how they're different. Ultimately, we want that to be, from an algorithmic point of view, perfectly integrated and optimized between the 2. That's the aim. And I think we're pretty close to that now that we've done a couple of these test cases of the more primitive comparison. I think there's the potential, and there's certainly the technology to integrate them together into a single system.
Dr. Gurney, going back to your chart, because I think that was really eye-opening for folks to see that the chart that was by city with the red and the black lines. Would it be possible for you to bring that back up and show people explicitly what a red line and a black line means in the different directions? Because I think people really wanted to understand that chart well, so they can kind of use it to understand what's going on. But
Sure.
Some of us got a little lost.
No problem. Okay, hopefully you're seeing, I won't go into presentation mode. Hopefully that's big enough to see.
Yes.
I'll make it a little larger. So as I said, we used 48 cities that really had enough information, enough documentation to be able to be as fair about this comparison as we could. And what you're seeing is down at the bottom, there's 2 metrics. There's a relative difference, which is just plain percentage difference between the total estimate that Vulcan came up with for that city, for all the comparable categories, and what the city inventory came up for all comparable categories. So that's a percentage difference. And most of the cities are in this, the black bars are to the right, which would represent underestimation in this case, that this is Vulcan estimating more than what the city inventory estimated. At the bottom of the graph where the black bars are to the left, it's the opposite. There were cities that had larger estimates than Vulcan. Far fewer, most of them had underestimates, but there's plenty of cities that matched really well, and certainly well within the uncertainty of Vulcan, which is what those little blue bars with the little caps are. Those are the uncertainty bounds on Vulcan. And so there's a collection of cities in the middle that that agree within the level of uncertainty. The red is an absolute uncertainty, and all that is just taking away the sign, because often what we care about is not so much whether it's under or over, but just in absolute terms, how different are the estimates. And so that's all that is. It's effectively turning those black bars into absolutes to get an absolute difference between the 2 estimates. And as I said, when you take the average of all the black bars, you get a number that's around 20%, which is about the center of mass of those black bars, a little bit above the midpoint here in the sort of where the black bars are to the right. You get an average of 20%. But in many ways, that average is not very, I mean, it's useful as a single number, but because there's so much scatter from one city to the next, that's in some ways, in my mind anyway, more important than the average. The fact that there is a lot of scatter. And again, we tried to look deeply, and in the paper, we went and tried to compare individual sectors. We tried to elucidate as best we could, why is this? What's going on? And as you might expect, there's a lot of reasons. It's not just one single reason, and there isn't even a single dominant reason. The one that came up that I would say, if anything, we saw more often than anything else, was the industrial sector is notoriously difficult to quantify, partly because fuel consumption in the industrial sector often is purchased off individual contracts. So in other words, it's not the natural gas utility supplying natural gas to an industrial process. They will have a one-off contract with the supplier for diesel or for residual fuel or lots of other things. And those contracts are difficult to get a hold of. And so they often got missed. And that was one thing we saw over and over again, is the industrial sector going awry. And the big reason was, while we agreed on natural gas, we did not agree on liquid fuels. They're just harder to track. And because we're availing of the CO emissions reporting, which really does include all that stuff, we were able to capture it. Including CO has its own set of uncertainties. It raises a whole other set of issues, but at least has the virtue of being kind of comprehensive to this type of thing. The other thing we saw probably was, lots of differences in the on-road sector, and that's not at all surprising. It sounds like San Diego's done something very similar to us, so I bet we would agree with San Diego a lot, because we use the MFAC model in California and Vulcan. And so, but many other cities do lots of other things. And I'll give you one example from my own city, Flagstaff, in which what they did was they used the retail sales of gasoline in all the gas stations within the city limits, and then calculated the carbon content of that fuel. Now, Flagstaff is an intersection point for a lot of interstate travel, both personal vehicle travel and commercial travel. And so effectively what they were doing is capturing emissions that ended up occurring, all across the United States for a couple hundred miles in either direction, given the average size of a tank in a vehicle. And that's obviously, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. That's not incorrect. It's just a very different way of conceptualizing what your city is responsible for. And though we tried to eliminate some of those funny comparisons, it was hard to do it completely. And some of those certainly were part of the distinction here. Now, Flagstaff was calling their inventory a scope 1 inventory, and that's why we included it, even though clearly they included a very different perspective. I would argue it probably isn't the right way to go about doing what they really intended to do, which is they wanted to have an inventory of what's going on in their city so that they could engage in policies that would affect residents of the city, not necessarily travelers coming in and out of the city or commercial trucks fueling up in Flagstaff. So those are a couple of examples, but there were plenty of others, and they varied. There was things in the airport sector that were done very differently in some cities. And again, I would go back to I think the basic bottom line conclusion out of this study was not so much the protocols that cities were using or the recipe books, but data. Data is the hard part. It's where I think all the effort is. It's hard just because it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of sleuthing. There's lots of bits of the emission empire that are in corners that are hard to find and be comprehensive about. And then the other thing is, when you're doing an individual city, it's hard to have context. One of the nice things about Vulcan, or one of the helpful things, is that it has the ultimate context. We add up to the right total at the nation state scale. All the cities add up correctly, and we can compare one city to another. So we can see, and we've seen this in looking at individual cities, where things clearly are wrong in our system. And we're able to quickly go in and find out what's happening. Because we have every city against every other city, we can normalize them by population, we can look at individual sectors, and you begin to see things that pop out and don't look right, and that allows you to correct them. And so that context is super helpful, which is, again, difficult if you're in an individual city. San Diego is probably different because you have California as a context, which is probably pretty good. But if you're in a city that has no state inventory, you come up with an inventory, it's very difficult to know, is this conserving mass properly? Is this making sense compared to the state, compared to other cities nearby? you don't have that context. And I think that's one of the helpful attributes of Vulcan. So hopefully that whoever asked that question, that gives you just a little bit more about what this plot represents and kind of what we teased out of the information.
Thank you. Marion, I think we're at the 7:15 mark, and I don't want to lose our chance to wrap up here while people are still with us. Thank you to all of our speakers, both for your really comprehensive presentations and also for fielding some tough questions. I hope that we kept the questions pretty on target with what you presented here. You guys are really drilling down into things we have not discussed before at the North County Climate Change Alliance. So this is really helpful to expose our whole group to the work that you're doing. I have to really spotlight Dr. Silva-Send's work. EPIC is so important to the work that we're doing here around the county at all the cities. And if folks don't really understand that, you need to know that a lot of our policy is really based on that bottom-up work that we're doing and trying to understand our estimates and how to refine and how to do better. So without that work, we would really be in the dark. So much appreciation to you and the group that does that work is super helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, I see some other questions there that I could answer, but they would need a lot of detail. I mean,
okay, yeah.
If you could go to the EPIC website and you could look at how we have improved the methods over time. So for example, how do you account for greenhouse gas travel between cities? And we do. The method is able, it allocates it in a certain way. And we've written up about those because we have come up with consistent methodologies so that we can compare our cities, the ones we do our inventories for within this region, you can compare, because we've come up with consistent methodologies, just like Kevin was saying. In order to compare, you'd have to make it consistent year to year. So I would suggest going to the website, and yeah, you're welcome.
Yes, I just want to add also how much we appreciate all your time and your expertise from all three of you. It's really, really great that you're here. And because of that, the North County Climate Change Alliance has bought a tree for each of you in your honor. And
oh, wow.
The tree will be planted in an area in California that has been scarred by the wildfires that we've been having. And I hope to be able to mail you a certificate, and you will be able to actually find and locate your particular tree on the web and keep track of it. So again, thank you.
That is nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's lovely.
Thanks for having us.
And before we go, I'd like to just reiterate a few of Dr. Gurney's words from the end of his presentation. He stated that the motivated stakeholder communities could really be contributory toward having these more accurate, more real-time methodologies implemented. And so who are the motivated stakeholder communities? Our participants today. And one more thing I want to mention, over the course of the majority of tonight's presentation, we had an unprecedented percentage of our attendees sticking with the group tonight. So that's a real sign that this was very well received. It was very important and very well articulated. So I want to thank everybody.
Welcome.
And super big thanks to the community who keeps showing up. It's wonderful to see people, our local people, and people coming in from out of state and out of the country. We really appreciate that. We also want you to remember that this is recorded. And so we hope that you'll share this with others. It's incredibly important how easy it is to get this information out to the rest of the world if we stop and take a moment to share our thoughts with others and let people know that this was recorded. These people are out here wanting to answer your questions in the broader community. So let's hope that this activates more people to understand what's going on in the world of monitoring and estimation, and how we use these feedback systems to really start changing our behavior.
And one last time, before I terminate tonight's meeting, I'll wait a few seconds for anybody who's interested in capturing the chat to do so in the lower right-hand corner of your chat screen.
Also, somebody was asking if somebody could drop the EPIC website into the chat for them.
Yeah, I will.
And then also the question is whether or not the slides will be shared. Sometimes speakers will share the slides and other times they don't, but that's been asked a couple of times. So I thought I would bring that up.
Maybe what we can do is if the speakers are interested or willing to share their slides, we can have Marianne send out, if it's in a link form,
Sure.
we could share that out. I don't think we don't want to try to do it as an attachment, but if you do have a way of sharing it as a link, we would be able to share that with folks.
All righty.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
All right.